Green. And I now welcome, I'm just checking with the Secretariat, that we do have representatives from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation online.
Yes, we do. Just Mr. McMurtry.
Okay, we're not waiting on anyone else?
No.
Okay, excellent. I apologise that we are running slightly late, and appreciate the ABC actually coming forward 2 hours in terms of our changed schedule. So I do welcome representatives from the ABC to give evidence. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? Mr. McMurtry, we can't hear you.
I apologise, Chair. It's Craig McMurtry, ABC Editorial Director.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false and misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and tracks parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you. Covering elections is one of the most important public service activities of the ABC, never more so in these times of misinformation and disinformation. For decades, the ABC's provided free-time election broadcasts so eligible political parties can put their policies directly to Australians, as well as the reporting of some of the most senior political journalists in the country, and expert analysis provided by my colleague Anthony Green, who you just heard from. The ABC also takes an educative focus at election time with our fact-check service, Vote Compass tool, which helps people understand respective party positions. And in 2019, we answered submitted audience questions in the You Ask, We Answer initiative online, where they asked things about the ballot paper or finding their voting place. In 2019, our federal election week coverage reached an estimated 10 million Australians. ABC television coverage of the federal election across the ABC main channel and ABC News channel was the most watched on election night, reaching 5.3 million Australians across the day and achieving a network metropolitan overnight share of over 30%. And ABC News was the nation's top digital news brand. The ABC's role as an independent source of news and information is paramount, and we protect our independence and integrity. We have noticed a concerning trend in recent times of the unauthorised use of ABC content and branding in occasional political advertising. We continue to block the unauthorised use of ABC branding and content, but should note that in recent state and territory elections, we've had to engage with parties to warn of one-off breaches of this policy, mostly on social platforms like Facebook and Twitter. In terms of fighting misinformation and disinformation, like others, the ABC welcomes moves toward greater transparency by Facebook and Google. Facebook's searchable ad library database has improved since the 2019 federal election and the range of information offered, and Google's now producing its transparency report. We think digital platforms like Facebook should provide more tools for media like the ABC to better manage, moderate and disable harmful user-generated comments. The ABC also supports taking a more consistent approach to leaders' debates. We support media plurality and debate formats should be shared, but we believe as a national public broadcaster at least one leaders' debate should be hosted by the ABC each federal election. And Chair, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for that. And I might kick off some of the questions. I understand that the ABC commissioned Kerry Blackburn to conduct a review into its election coverage from the 2019 federal election. Is that correct?
Kerry Blackburn was one of a number of academics we worked with.
Did Kerry Blackburn conduct a review, a single review?
She did a piece of work for us, which was about helping us in our debriefs with content teams and refreshing our program briefs for 2020 and looking ahead, of course, to the next federal election. She was one of 3 or 4 academics who worked with us. The focus was an educative one to work with content teams, and, of course, all of this activity is always reported to the ABC board.
Who were the other academics?
Oh, I don't have those names with me. I'm sorry. I'll need to come back to you with that.
Can someone? How many people work for the ABC?
You mean in terms of reviews?
Oh, just in terms of generally, how many? What are the FTEs for the ABC?
I think roughly 3,000 to 4,000, Chair.
Well, I hope that one of them could perhaps pass that information to you, because I'm sure they're probably listening into this, and you'll be able to answer that be able to answer that question while we're continuing. So you said a piece of work. So is it a report or a briefing note?
Chair, it's both verbal and written communication. Yes, it comes into us. We publish reviews. I know it's not central to what you're asking about. We publish reviews. The Election Coverage Review Committee report is published and publicly available. The I Censure Share of Voice report similarly. And then we do a range of debriefs with teams. We work with academics. We look at our content. We review what we do at election time.
In relation to Ms. Blackburn's review, did it make any recommendations?
All of the academics we work with make suggestions, some of which we accept, some of which we don't share.
Are suggestions recommendations?
Well, I suppose they can be, yes.
Okay. How much did the review of Ms. Blackburn cost?
I will need to come back to you with that information as well, Chair. I apologise, but I wasn't expecting a focus on this particular question line, so I will provide you with that information. I don't have it readily to hand. Okay.
And also the cost of any other reviews or reports or whatever you want to call them into the 2019 election in terms of the cost of the work undertaken by these other unnamed academics. In relation to Ms. Blackburn's review, has that been made public?
The work that she did with us and the work of the other academics has been used internally, Chair.
So it hasn't. So it's something that's within the ABC that hasn't been released publicly.
No.
Why wouldn't you release it?
Because not everything we do is designed to be published. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, the debrief processes can be quite elaborate. They deal with a lot of program content, and it's quite an extensive process that we run afterwards. And we certainly want to be transparent, which is why we published the Election Coverage Review Committee report, why we published the Share of Voice report. But no, we do not publish everything. But everything we do with external reviewers is, of course, reported in the normal way to the ABC board.
But in terms of this specific review of Ms. Blackburn, I'm asking you to make it public. Would you make it public?
It's not my decision, Chair.
Okay, well, whose decision is it?
It's ultimately, Chair, it sits with the ABC board.
Okay, well, could you take on notice that I'm asking that the review of Ms. Blackburn be made public, and that the review or report of whatever you want to call it in relation to any other work undertaken by these unnamed academics also be made public. Look, did the review of Ms. Blackburn make any findings of bias?
Chair, it made a number of observations, but I think it would be better, since you've asked already a series of questions to have been taken on notice, that I would respectfully suggest that I take all of these questions on notice and come back to you with the answers.
But you surely would know whether the review made observations or suggestions or comments about bias.
So, Chair, I'm sure it won't surprise you. When we work, whether it's with reviewers or academics or whatever, there is good and bad always. So I can accurately say that there are always positive things said about the accuracy of the coverage, the extent of it, its comprehensive nature, its quality, and yes, with any comment or any work we do with academics or reviewers, we also look for them to provide critical feedback as well.
Okay. So just remind me, who commissioned Ms. Blackburn and the other unnamed academics?
Senator, ultimately it's commissioned by the Managing Director of the ABC. Yeah.
Okay. So the findings / review recommendations, suggestions, commentary, that has been provided to within the ABC. So how widely has it been dispersed in the ABC? Is it just at a board level or senior management, management team, or is it something that the 4,000 FTEs, does everyone there have access to these reports?
Chair, look, I'll have to take on notice exactly how many people have seen the report, the review, the commentary. It certainly isn't the case that absolutely every FTE who works for the ABC has seen it, no.
Okay. Don't you think that I know you've taken on board the cost of the review, but this is a review that taxpayers' money has been spent on to pay academics to do a review into the ABC's election coverage. Don't you think in the interest of transparency that these reviews should be made public?
Chair, I think it can be fairly stated the ABC is probably the most transparent media organisation in the country. In terms of my role, the objective is always to keep the board informed of what we're doing. And our predisposition is to publish when we commission full and finalised reviews.
Well, I think you've taken on notice. I'll certainly ask us to take on notice that I would like any review or reports in relation to the 2019, to the coverage of the ABC in relation to the 2019 federal election to be released, considering they are paid for by the taxpayers. Are there any other? You've mentioned a couple of them. Are there any other editorial reviews or submissions, or whatever you want to call it, that have been undertaken by the ABC that we're unaware of?
We have a continuous improvement process, as I'm sure you would expect, where we like to work with subject specialists in terms of improving our coverage and our content all the time. We have published, I think, something like 21 external reviews. The most recent one deals with our COVID-19 coverage. And so I think there is a track record of transparency there.
Just as a matter of interest, how many allegations of bias did the ABC receive in relation to its coverage of the 2019 federal election?
Chair, we received 322 written complaints relating to the 2019 election. That was a 22% reduction on 2016. There were 249 of those claimed bias. They were investigated by our independent audience and consumer affairs team. There were no upheld complaints, and that compares with in 2016 where there were 4 upheld complaints.
Okay, just in the interest of time, I will have some further questions in addition to the ones you've already taken on notice in relation to that. So I will hand over to Senator Brown for Labor to ask further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
James, Ms. Thwaites will lead the questioning for Labor. Thank you.
Of course. Ms. Thwaites, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. McMurtry, for appearing today. Kate Thwaites, member for Jagga Jagga. If I can take you to your submission where you talk about the political advertising blackout period and say that in your view it's outdated, is it your view that that political advertising blackout period should be abolished altogether, or that social media platforms should be incorporated into the existing blackout period?
Our view is that we understand the point of the blackout, but it doesn't really recognise, as your question reflects, the reality of the digital world we all live in now. So it should either be applied, I would suggest it should either be applied universally, and I believe Facebook has indicated that it plans to ban political ads in the lead up to the US presidential election in November, or if it can't be applied universally, I think the position ought to be that a partial blackout, i.e. a blackout that currently impacts broadcast, radio and TV, just isn't effective.
We did hear evidence from Facebook this morning that they'd be willing to consider having the blackout extended to them. So your view is if that was consistent across platforms, that would be part of the solution to the current situation where it's not even.
Yes. So we observe the blackout period, even though we don't have paid political advertising. But and you know, in these days of where we're all concerned about misinformation and disinformation, we understand the reason for it. But yes, if it's not going to be applied universally on digital platforms as well as broadcast and print platforms, then there doesn't seem to be much point.
And on that issue of misinformation and disinformation, as you're probably aware, the Digital Platforms Inquiry recommended that the digital platforms develop a voluntary code to address complaints about disinformation, together with ACMA. Do you think a voluntary code would be sufficient for addressing misinformation and news quality on digital platforms?
The ABC doesn't really have a position on whether it should be voluntary or mandatory. We like the idea of a code, and you know, it is true that with the utility of the Facebook searchable ad library database and the transparency reports that Google is now producing, the digital platforms are trying. But no, we don't have a particular position on whether or not that code ought to be mandatory or voluntary.
And you mentioned that you've had an issue with content being shared on digital platforms that misuses the ABC brand. Is there more that the digital platforms could be doing to promote or, I guess, boost trusted content from sources like the ABC?
Well, we would certainly like to be prioritised in that way. But my reference before to the use of the ABC brand and content was more in terms of the activity of political parties themselves on their Facebook and Twitter pages, where there have been posts of ABC content and the ABC logo that's been used in a way that is clearly designed to be part of their political messaging. And it's been our long-standing position that we don't allow unauthorised use of the ABC brand or content by political parties in that way. And there's just been a number of episodes recently, and again, all on digital platforms.
Still on digital platforms, and the announcement from Facebook that they are considering whether they ban news content on the platform if the ACCC's draft news media bargaining code is enacted. What do you think the impact of that would be on the spread of misinformation if it happened in an election environment?
Oh, I think it's pretty obvious. I think that for mainstream media, I think all Australian media, this isn't just a comment about the ABC, is credible, works really hard in election time, and these sorts of sources have a long-established record. They have solid editorial practices and frameworks and standards that they observe. There is a regulatory regime behind them, which we're all aware of. And so it's very, very important that that information is available on all of these digital platforms.
So without that news content during an election period, what sort of content would people see on their digital platforms, do you think?
Look, I'm not an expert about what they would see, but I guess we all know the atomised nature of the digital world we live in, the misinformation, the disinformation, the trolling that goes on, micro-targeting, dealing with falsehoods. I mean, for example, we have RMIT ABC Fact Check. It peddles furiously during election campaigns to try and call out falsehoods. Obviously, the focus is on fact-checking, statements made by politicians, but it's not just that during elections. Now, currently, that team has, I think, something like 3 or 4 researchers. We had to partner with RMIT because funding cuts of the ABC, we couldn't afford to fully fund it ourselves. They work really, really hard. Their audience has grown, and services like ABC Fact Check are just so crucial in this day and age.
Do you know how many fact checks they did during the last election period? We just heard from Facebook that their fact checkers fact-checked 17 items, which didn't seem like a lot to me during an election period. Would you know what the equivalent for the ABC during that period would have been?
I don't have a hard number for you, I'm sorry, but I know that they fact-checked one of the leaders' debates, and that was watched by more than 1 million, or the fact-checks were consumed, I suppose, by more than 1 million users, and they put out a number of fact-checks on economic and climate policy and other things during the election campaign. But a hard number I can't give you, but it was a substantial number, particularly when you consider how small that unit is.
And you just mentioned that you've had to partner with RMIT to provide that service given ABC funding cuts, and I also note your opening statement about the number of people who rely on ABC coverage during an election period. What impact are funding cuts having on the ABC's election coverage, and what do you think would be the impact of current funding cuts on the next federal election?
Well, planning for the next federal election is underway, so we're still putting that together. Funding cuts clearly make things extremely difficult for us. I think our Managing Director has been very clear that there's just simply nothing left in our back office to be cut, that there are serious consequences of funding cuts. Of course, we will always work the hardest we can to provide Australians with the best election coverage that we can, because it is absolutely core to what the ABC does. I can't tell you here exactly how these funding cuts will impact on our election coverage, because we go the extra mile. People work extra hours. Everybody puts in, as you would expect. And that I think that often cuts have a more incremental impact on our day-to-day coverage rather than in special events like elections, which are, of course, a high priority for us.
So in an environment where we're relying on organisations like the ABC to counter some of that misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing, are you saying that there may be less of that information available for Australian voters in the lead up to the next election?
We will certainly do everything we possibly can to make sure that there is as much, if not more, but it doesn't make the job any easier, of course. And I know that with the fact-checkers, for example, because they are already under pressure, and we would love to have more resources for the fact-checks and for the other work that we do. So it is a struggle, but we will obviously do our very, very best.
And just on election reviews, is it standard for the ABC to conduct editorial reviews of your election coverage?
Yes, so we always publish an election coverage review report. We commission an external I censure share of voice report, which is also published, and it is also perfectly normal for us to work internally with subject specialists and with academics and with our journalists and program teams to go through our election coverage and to identify where we could have done better and to seek to improve. It's a standard operating approach.
Okay. If I can just ask you some questions as well about the Vote Compass tool. How does the ABC promote the use of Vote Compass during elections?
Well, we talk about it on air and we promote it online on our websites and platforms and on our official social media accounts.
Do you do any targeting with that? Do you target particular elections or electorates or demographics?
I don't believe so, but I can double check that.
Yeah, if you could, please. And if you could also tell me, do you have metrics around take-up of Vote Compass and how many people and where they were?
So if memory serves, I think it was something like 1.6 million users engaged with the Vote Compass tool at the last election. In terms of the spread of that engagement, I couldn't give you an answer off the top of my head. But it's always, it's a voter engagement tool. It's not an opinion poll. It doesn't seek to predict a result. It's really about promoting electoral literacy and making sure that voters, doing everything we can anyway to ensure that voters understand the issues that are being discussed and the respective positions of the political parties.
If you could take that on notice about if you have any other data about where people were using that tool, that would be helpful, please. You just mentioned that it's a tool around voter literacy. Do you think there are risks involved in the tool and how people use it, and do you take efforts to mitigate those risks?
Again, it's always reviewed afterwards, and we always seek to improve it. It's a product that was developed by data scientists from VoxPop Labs. We partner with them. The Melbourne University partners with us as well. And it's the nature of academia, I guess, and the scientists and researchers who work on it, that they are always striving to improve it.
Okay. Just back to misinformation and disinformation this time in the context of advertising, as we've had a lot of submissions to the committee in this context talking about the need for truth in political advertising laws. Is that something the ABC would have a view on in terms of whether we need truth in political advertising laws and how they should be implemented?
So the ABC doesn't have a position on truth in advertising legislation. As a journalist and editor, I would simply make the obvious observation, I suppose, that it is one thing to try and make calls on outrageous falsehoods and lies or whatever. But of course, political messaging and the political argument or debate that goes on in an election campaign in particular is nearly always more subtle and subjective than that. So I guess the only observation I would make is the capacity to actually make it meaningful.
As in, someone to make a ruling on political advertisements is what you're saying is difficult?
Yes, because of the subjective nature of it, the tactics that I'm sure the people in that room know better than me that can be used to make a political case. I think calling out what is true and what is not, I'm sure as an idea everybody would support truth in advertising, but the drawing up meaningful legislation and executing it is more difficult.
Okay. Thank you, Mr McMurtry. Chair, no further questions from me.
Thank you, Ms Thwaites. Senator Waters, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much, folks, for joining us today and for the ongoing excellent scrutiny and work that the ABC provides despite successive funding cuts and staff reductions as a result of those cuts. With that said, I just want to reprise some of the fact check. You covered some with the last questioner, but I'm interested in the morphing of fact check to RMIT. Do you have any views on the impact of that partnership on the volume and the rigour of the fact-checking unit?
We're very confident in the rigour of the fact-check unit. So the partnership was really a consequence of the funding pressures that we've been under. And as we've already spoken of, misinformation, disinformation is becoming a more serious, not less serious problem. So we think fact-check's very important. The fact checks are subject to our editorial standards. When we publish them, they are subject to the same editorial standards. And there has never, to my knowledge, there has never been an upheld complaint about a fact check. Their record is pretty much impeccable, And the journalists and researchers who work on that very small team have come from the ABC and from other media organisations as well, and they do excellent work.
Okay. When you say very small team, how many folk have you got that are on that team from ABC at the minute versus how many you had, what have been the impact on the staffing numbers of the funding cuts? How many did you used to have on the fact-check unit versus how many have you got now over successive years?
I would need to take that on notice and come back to
Okay.
you. I don't have the precise numbers with me, I'm sorry.
All right, no, that's fine. Thanks for taking that on notice. I'm also interested in if you could restore fact-check to its previous ABC-only iteration, what funding would be required to do that? It's obviously linked to the staffing question. Okay, does the ABC have any specific policies about balance during election campaigns? For example, who's invited as guests onto programs or what events are covered by news programs?
So we, as I mentioned before, we have the iCensure Share of Voice report. The Election Coverage Review Committee meets on a weekly basis. We get an external count delivered to us by iCensure that looks at all the ABC outputs and looks at the relative share of voice of the parties, so we can monitor to ensure that the alignment's suitable. We obviously don't go for absolute 50-50 because, issues bubble up that are within parties dealing with candidates, but we look to ensure that things are roughly aligned and that we are satisfied that that our coverage is being objective. And essentially we track it during the campaign and then we report it publicly at the end of the campaign.
Okay. And pardon my ignorance, but when you say roughly aligned, do you mean aligned to the previous election result or?
No, we just need to satisfy ourselves that that the coverage is fairly reflecting share of voice, that the parties are getting adequate representation. And we also just need to ensure at the same time that we're not over-indexing in one area just for the sake of balance. So it is a fine line that we have to observe, but we follow it. We make these judgments week by week through the campaign to ensure that the representativeness of sources on our outputs is appropriate, and I think we do a pretty good job.
Mm. And as a public broadcaster, what role do you think ABC plays in assisting the community, particularly marginalised communities such as First Nations, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds? What role do you think ABC plays in assisting those communities to understand the electoral process and things like preferential voting and political issues? Have you got any examples of policies or practices adopted to further that outreach?
So we have small language teams in our Asia Pacific newsroom in Melbourne. We are doing more and more in this area, and as one small example, the You Ask, We Answer service, looking at ways that we can provide that service in language as well to help with voter education in culturally and linguistically diverse communities.
Okay. There were some great questions asked before about Vote Compass, and I think you took on notice to tell us a bit more about the numbers of engagement. I'm interested in the timing of that engagement. Are you able to track when people use Vote Compass in terms of proximity to polling date? And if you could let us know the shape of the time of engagement, I'd be very interested to know of that. Perhaps if you could take that one on notice.
Sure.
Just on fake news, do you think we need an industry code of conduct on fake news?
An industry code of conduct on fake news. Well, we have already a substantial regulatory framework. I know that ACMA is working on the voluntary code that was discussed earlier in questions. I guess it's one of those absolutes, isn't it? It's a bit like truth in advertising. Do we all agree that there shouldn't be such a thing as fake news? Yes. Do we all have the same worldview about what constitutes fake news? Almost certainly not, is how I would answer that question, which is probably unhelpful.
Well, I suppose it's something we're all trying to grapple with, and finding the best policy solution to an issue that's vexed is tricky. What's your view on whether we need an independent regulator to handle complaints about inaccurate information?
The ABC doesn't really have a view on that, because, to be honest, it's not something. Well, we obviously focus on what we are expected to deliver, and delivering that to the best possible standard to all Australians. And there is already a substantial regulatory framework that surrounds the ABC. So I guess to answer that question effectively, I would need to know a little bit more about what that role would be, how it would work, how it would synchronise with the rest of the regulatory framework that we already have. It's a difficult question to just answer on the run without sort of more flesh on the bones.
Okay. All right. Well, look, just one final question for me, and it's a bit ambient, but in the context of the need for fair reporting, which I'm sure everybody accepts and no one would have any difficulty with, what does that mean for climate change reporting, given the tiny proportion of scientists who don't accept the vast majority view that we're in a climate crisis, and given the politics that sadly surrounds this issue, even though it's less political in other nations? How do you approach fair reporting when it comes to reporting on the urgency of the climate crisis and any politics that surrounds that?
So our editorial position is that climate change, there's an enormous global scientific consensus around climate change and the role of human activity in climate change. So our long-standing position on this now has been that we don't accord the view of those who disagree that climate change is happening equal time. That is not a requirement. That doesn't mean that we deplatform or ban alternative views, but essentially we report the science based on the overwhelming scientific consensus, and characterisations about whether it's a crisis or the debate over the urgency or the need to act and in what form, that's something that we report, of course, across all our platforms, and we report it objectively and where it is relevant. And there are views that climate change does not exist, or that action should not be taken where it is relevant in news terms. We will report that. But our editorial position is that there is overwhelming scientific consensus on this point.
Okay. Well, look, thank you very much for your ongoing work despite successive funding reductions, and hopefully that can be rectified in years to come. Appreciate your time. No more from me. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Waters. I'm just checking whether any other members of the committee have any questions. If not, thank you very much for coming along. I know you've undertaken to take a number of questions on notice, and I think there'll be some more coming your way, so thank you for that. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence with an opportunity to correct any transcription errors. Thank you very much, and you are free to leave. In terms of those who are listening, the committee will now take a short break for lunch, and will recommence at 1 p.m. Queensland time with ACMA, and then we'll have the AEC. So thank you very much, and we'll be speaking to everybody at 1 o'clock. Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye.